Wisdom of the Middle Way. Nagarjuna's Mulamadhyamakarika. Translation and commentary by J. L. Garfield. Part 2, the Text and Commentary. Chapter 11, Examination of the Initial and Final Limits. But suppose that one could see that the self, considered as agent or as subject, lacks inherent existence, and still one argued that nonetheless it must do so in virtue of its impermanence and being subject to change. Then, one might argue, birth, aging, and death must be real as the conditions of the self's unreality. This is the position with which Nagarjuna concerns himself in this chapter. But he is also concerned with the generalization of this question to the birth, aging, and death of all of cyclic existence. And it is this more general problem with which he actually opens the chapter, developing the account of individual impermanence as a special case. 1. When asked about the beginning, the great sage said that nothing is known of it. Cyclic existence is without end and beginning. So there is no beginning or end. The question about the existence and nature of the origin of the world is one of the questions that Sakyamuni Buddha declared to be unanswerable. Nagarjuna here interprets that to mean that there is nothing coherent that can be said about the origin of the world. Given the striking similarity between the questions that the Buddha declared unanswerable and those that Kant argues to be unanswerable by reason in the antinomies of pure reason, there is much to be said for this diagnosis. So Nagarjuna here claims that we cannot make sense of the beginning or end of all of cyclic existence. Beginnings and ends are beginnings and ends of actual, conventionally designated and delimited processes within cyclic existence. 2. Where there is no beginning or end, how could there be a middle? It follows that thinking about this in terms of prior, posterior, and simultaneous is not appropriate. The concept of a middle, Nagarjuna argues, is bound up with those of beginnings and ends. We can say that we and all phenomena are within cyclic existence, but to posit determinate absolute spatiotemporal locations is senseless. 3. If birth came first, and then old age and death, then birth would be ageless and deathless, and a deathless one would be born. Birth, old age, and death here are to be understood in an absolute sense. Of course, conventionally, the birth of a particular human being comes before her/his aging, which precedes her/his death. But that should not lead us to think of that birth as the origin of an entity, that aging as the midpoint in the life of that entity, or that death as the end of that entity. If one adopts a doctrine of rebirth, as does Nagarjuna and as do all of his interlocutors, the point can be made quite straightforwardly. For any sentient continuum, every birth is preceded by an aging and a death, and so forth. But even setting aside the particular doctrine of rebirth, we can elucidate this insight with equal force, to see particular entities as having determinate, non-conventional beginnings of existence and determinate, non-conventional termini and, hence, that there are distinct times at which there is a clear fact of the matter about whether or not they exist, independent of conventions for their individuation, is to see those entities as having necessary and sufficient characteristics for their identity, that is, as having essences. But the central thesis Nagarjuna is defending is that this very conception of what it is to exist is incoherent, that things are empty of such essences, and that the boundaries of objects are conventional and indeterminate. There is no fixed boundary between the existence of a seed, the tree to which it gives rise, a piece of wood from that tree, and a table fashioned therefrom, or between the existence of an intact table, a broken table, wooden table parts, ashes, earth, the nutrients for a seed, that seed, the sapling to which it gives rise, and another tree. Once we see the world from the standpoint of emptiness of inherent existence, the history of any conventionally designated entity is but an arbitrary stage carved out of a vast continuum of interdependent phenomena. The arising of any phenomenon, human, non-human sentient being, or inanimate object is the consequence of the disintegration of others. That disintegration succeeds their arising and aging. Once we give up the intrinsic identity of entities, the constant cycle of death, birth, aging, and rebirth of entities is unavoidable. 4. If birth were to come after, and old age and death first, how could there be a causeless aging and death of one not born? But birth has to precede death as well, on pain of the absurdity of something that is unborn dying. And, as Nagarjuna points out in the next verse, we must think conventionally of these things in sequence because any conventionally designated object undergoes them in order. 5. Birth and age and death cannot occur at one time. Then what is being born would be dying, and both would occur without cause. 6. When the series of the prior, simultaneous, and posterior is not possible. Why are you led to posit this birth, aging, and death? The birth, aging, and death that the opponent has in mind can be represented at two levels. At the most general level, it is the birth, aging, and death of cyclic existence, the examination of which frames this discussion. At that level, Nagarjuna is pointing out that these conceptions, having legitimate employment only within the empirical realm, are nonsense. But the opponent could also be interpreted as positing birth, aging, and death as determinate, intrinsically identifiable moments in the evolution of empirical phenomena, or, specifically, of sentient beings. Nagarjuna rejects that as well, arguing that moments intrinsically prior to, simultaneous with, or posterior to the existence of entities cannot be identified, given the lack of intrinsic identity of the entities themselves. So long as one in conceiving of phenomena thinks of them as temporally determinate and bounded, and thinks of the identity of things as intrinsic to them, one will have to identify their beginnings, middles, and ends. But this leads to paradox, given the indeterminateness, interdependence, and interpenetration of things. Nagarjuna hence advises the rejection of this ontology. 7. Not only is cyclic existence itself without beginning, no existent has a beginning. Neither cause and effect, nor character and characterized. The alternative, both with respect to cyclic existence as a whole and with respect to individual entities, is to reject the ontology of entities and characteristics altogether, along with the boundaries and determinate relations that ontology requires. 8. Nor feeling and the feeler, whatever there is. All entities are without beginning.